After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the concept of psychological testing, differentiate between psychological assessment and psychological testing, know the nature and characteristic features of psychological tests, know the applications of psychological testing in various settings, identify the attributes of a good psychological test, trace the historical underpinnings of psychological testing. A layman meeting a psychologist considers him no less than a magician who has the skill of reading intelligence, personality, motivations, attitudes, values, interests, social skills of others. Psychologists respond to this curiosity and elevated hopes of others by means of tools of psychological testing and assessment. Maloney and Ward distinguish testing from assessment in regard to their respective objectives. The objective of psychological testing is to measure the magnitude of a psychological attribute. In assessment, by contrast, the aim is to go beyond the numerical measure to reflect on the strength or absence of a psychological attribute. This module heaves light on the concept of psychological assessment and psychological testing. It explains the applications of psychological testing in various settings and discusses the nature and characteristics of psychological tests. Detailed account and intriguing efforts involved in historical origin and development of psychological testing across the globe are also documented. Psychological tests are standardized measurement tools consisting of a series of questions called items which assess certain aspects of a person's individuality and describes it in terms of scores or categories. A good psychological test or a good measuring tool or instrument is reliable, valid, have well defined norms and contain clear instructions for administering, scoring and interpretation. Psychological tests have widespread applications in a variety of settings including educational, organizational, human resource management, counseling, clinical, consumer and military domains. Psychological assessment and testing, what are they? Consider an example in which an assessor is interested in gauging the numerical value of a student by administering a standard psychological test of intelligence. One might prefer of using the term intelligence testing in such a case. In contrast, consider another example in which an evaluator is not just interested in obtaining the IQ score of a student, but rather wishes to answer a referral question about his performance in a regular classroom by exploring his intellectual strengths and weaknesses. In other words, he attempts to understand his student's problem in the broader framework for which a wide range of information will be required and new methods need to be applied along with routine standardized intelligence testing. In such a case, the term intelligence assessment would be preferable to the term intelligence testing. Used synonymously and interchangeably by many, psychological testing and psychological assessment carry different objectives and meanings. Maloney and Ward articulated the differences between the two. Psychometric tests usually just add up the number of correct answers or the number of certain types of responses or performances with little if any regard for the how or mechanics of such content, Clinical assessment is often far more interested in how the individual processes rather than the results of what he processes. The two operations, in fact, serve very different goals and purposes. Psychological test. Psychological tests are tools consisting of a series of questions called items which assess certain aspects of a person's individuality and describe it in terms of scores and categories. Used in wide variety of settings like clinical, academic, organizational, military, etc., psychological testing entails behavioral observation and provides solutions to some of the life's most vital questions. As defined by Maloney and Ward, it is the process of administering, scoring, and interpreting psychological tests. In this, decisions and predictions about a client or subject are made entirely on the basis of the test scores. The objective of psychological testing is limited to measure the magnitude of some psychological trait or attribute. Psychological assessment. Psychological assessment, on the other hand, is a broad umbrella term referring to the process of thoughtful appraisal and evaluation of the client or testee to explore his strengths and weaknesses by a highly trained tester. The aim of assessment goes beyond the numerical indices of more technical like purpose of testing, but comprises of rich texture of the thoughtful problem solving processes. Psychological assessment acknowledges that tests are one type of instrument used by professional assessors to gauge a client's behavior, but assessment goes beyond the use of psychological tests as a key to meaningful evaluation. In many evaluation contexts, the term assessment is preferable to testing. According to Cohen and Swerdlick, psychological assessment is the gathering and integration of psychological related data for the purpose of making a psychological evaluation accomplished through the use of the tools such as tests, interviews, case studies, behavioral observations, and specially designed apparatuses and measurement procedures. They define psychological testing as the process of measuring psychology related variables by means of devices or procedures designed to obtain a sample of behavior. Since the field of psychometrics is primarily concerned with the construction and validation of measurement instruments such as questionnaires, tests, and personality assessments, a detailed account of psychological testing is highlighted in the module. Some more definitions of psychological test. Psychological tests, varied and wide in the use and approach, are not easy to define. Many definitions of psychological tests are proposed by many researchers. In its simplest form, a test can be defined as a measuring instrument or device designed to measure a variable or an attribute. Drawing on this definition of test, a psychological test refers to a measuring instrument or device designed to measure psychological variables and attributes, example intelligence, personality, interest, aptitude, beliefs, values, etc. Various definitions of psychological test are proposed in academic literature. According to Bean, a test is an organized succession of stimuli designed to measure quantitatively or to evaluate qualitatively some mental process, trait, or characteristic. Frank Freeman has defined a psychological test as a standardized instrument designed to measure objectively one or more aspect of a total personality by means of samples of performance on behavior. According to Elmer Lemke and William Wiersma, a psychological test is a device for quantitative assessment, educational and psychological assessment, and educational and psychological attributes of an individual. According to them, operationally, a test secures a sample of behavior. As quoted by Anne Anastasi, a psychological test is essentially an objective and standardized measure of a sample of behavior. Gregory has defined a psychological test as a standardized procedure for sampling behavior and describing it with categories of scores. In addition, most tests have norms or standards by which the result can be used to predict other more important behavior. According to Singh, a psychological test or educational test is a standardized procedure to measure quantitatively or qualitatively one or more than one aspect of a trait by means of a sample of verbal or non-verbal behavior. McIntyre and Miller proposed that psychological tests are instruments that require the testee to perform some behavior. The behavior performed is used to measure some personal attribute, trait or characteristic such as intelligence that is thought to be important in describing and understanding the behavior. So often, going through the above definitions, it appears that a test consists of a series of items on the basis of which some information is sought about one or more aspect of an individual or group's traits, abilities, motives, attitude and so on. This is done by making individuals or group perform on a series of questions called test items which elicit the desired behavior related to the intended trait or ability being measured. As it can be seen from some definitions mentioned, some behavioral dimensions of a person's individuality like personality and intelligence have received more attention compared to others. McIntyre and Miller have offered a continuum of some of the most and least commonly recognized type of psychological tests, nature and characteristics of psychological tests. A simple look to previously mentioned definitions of a psychological test is enough to bring out their essential characteristics. According to the definition given by Robert J. Gregory, the chief characteristics of a psychological test are standardized behavior, that is, a test is considered to be standardized if the procedure for administering it is uniform from one examiner and setting to another. This is ensured by outlining clear-cut instructions for the administration of test in the test manual. Behavior sample, that is, a test targets a well-defined and infinite behavior or domain known as the sample of behavior due to the constraints involved in truly comprehensive testing. For example, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale WISE uses 35 carefully selected words to judge the vocabulary of testee. Scores or categories, that is, it is based on the premise that whatever exists at all exists in some amount, and anything that exists in an amount can be measured. This essentially means that psychological tests assign some specific number or category to some abstract quality, for example, aptitude, memory, etc., according to some rules of measurement. Applications of psychological testing. Psychological tests are used in a variety of settings. Tests administered in classrooms to assess ability, aptitude, or interest of a student with respect to a particular occupation or stream of studies represents the use of psychological testing in academic and educational settings. When used in counseling settings, psychological tests aim to bring improvement in the assessee's adjustment, productivity, and quality of life. In clinical settings, psychological testing aids in screening and diagnosis of behavioral problems in patients. A psychotherapist uses diverse assessment procedures and psychological testing to know the effect of a particular type of psychotherapy on client's condition. In the business world, a wide range of achievement, aptitude, personality, interest, and motivational assessments are done to make significant decisions about hiring, promotions, transfers, trainings, performance, and eligibility of employees. Psychological testing is also an important tool to track the pulse of consumer behavior. Using a wide variety of attitude and value tests, consumer psychologists appropriately judge the public receptivity to a new brand, a new product, or a new advertising or a marketing campaign. Psychological testing is an integral part of the process of development of psychological theories. More recently, the field of psychometrics is gaining popularity in forensic medicine. Qualities of a good psychological test. With such a widespread application of psychological testing in many arenas, assessment professionals are keen on evaluating the quality of tests. The criteria for a good test are laid down. Some of the essential qualities that a good psychological test must have are: a good psychological test should have precise definitions of concepts pertaining to the phenomena or the attributes being measured. Clear instructions for administration, scoring, and interpretations must be laid down. Psychometric soundness. This includes reliability and validity of a measure. These two are extremely important properties of all sound measures. The validity of a measure is defined as the degree to which a measure actually measures what it claims or seeks to measure. In other words, a test is considered valid when it measures what it is purported to measure. Thus, an intelligence test must measure the level of intelligence and not any other related construct or attribute. Traditionally, three basic types of validity have been established, each of which relates to a different aspect of the measurement situation. These are content validity, empirical validity, and construct validity. Another criterion essential for ensuring the psychometric soundness of a psychological test is reliability. The reliability of a measure is the degree to which the results of measurement are free of error. A measuring instrument is considered reliable if its results remain constant when the measurement of a given attribute is taken by different observers or at different points in time. In other words, a perfectly measuring instrument consistently measures in the same way on repeated trials. It gives consistent results from one set of measurement to another. It may be pointed out that some error is bound to occur in any type of measurement. To the extent to which a measurement error is slight, a measure is said to be reliable. Reliability of a measuring tool can be established by the methods of test-retest, parallel forms, split half, and methods of rational equivalence. Norms or standards. The performance of a test taker on a particular psychological test is done by comparing his or her scores with the performance scores of other test takers. Norms are statistical average series of a large and representative group of subjects. Norms help in determining the test taker's relative standing in comparison to a representative population. A good psychological test must have adequate norms for evaluation and interpretation. History of psychological testing. Psychological testing as it is today is the outcome of many years informal and formal effort to assess the human abilities in certain terms and make predictions on the basis of it. Historically, there is much varied geography of psychological testing. According to Erford, the Greeks may have been the first to use assessments for educational or military purpose. Most of the scholars and textbooks trace the origin of psychological testing in the 11th century BCE in China, when Chinese set up civil service exams for the selection of mandarins. Every third year in China, oral examinations were given to help evaluate the work of the employees and make decisions about their promotions. The testing movement gains its psychological character with the publication of Charles Darwin's all-time influential book, The Origin of Species. Darwin's idea offered major impetus to work on the individual differences, and it was Sir Francis Galton, a relative of Darwin, who soon began applying Darwin's idea to the study of human abilities. In his book Hereditary Genius, Galton contended that some persons possess certain characteristics that made them more fit than others, and he carried out a series of experimental studies to validate his observations. Galton did important work on individual differences, which was later extended by the US psychologist James McKeen Cattell, who coined the term mental test. Cattell's doctoral dissertation was based on Galton's work on individual differences in reaction time. The works of Galton and Cattell offered the stage for the development and growth in the modern testing and led to its present status as we see today. In the previous century, however, three major areas of application, that is clinical, educational and industrial, acted like three major forces which led to the phenomenal increase and growth in the development of psychological tests. Psychological testing and psychological assessment, commonly used synonymously, carry different objectives and meanings. The objective of psychological testing is to measure the magnitude of some psychological trait or attribute. The aim of psychological assessment goes beyond the numerical indices of more technical, like purpose of testing, but comprises of rich texture of the thoughtful problem-solving process. According to Robert J. Gregory, a test refers to a standardized procedure for sampling behavior and describing it with categories of scores. According to Anne Anastasi, a psychological test is essentially an objective and standardized measure of a sample of behavior. A good psychological test should have precise definitions of concepts pertaining to the phenomena or the attributes being measured, and clear instructions for administration, scoring and interpretations. A psychological test must have psychometric soundness, that is, it should be reliable and valid. The reliability of a measure is the degree to which the results of measurements are free of error. The validity of a measurement is defined as the degree to which a measure actually measures what it claims or seeks to measure. A psychological test must have well-defined norms to determine the test taker's relative standing in comparison to a representative population. Psychological tests have widespread applications in a variety of settings, including educational, organizational, human resource management, counseling, clinical, consumer and military domains. Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, Raymond Cattell and many other pioneers offered the stage for the development and growth in the modern psychological testing and led to its present status as we see today.